This is a short introduction to ethnographic interviews, primarily recorded for the Community Documentation Project hosted by the Arts Council of the Southern Finger Lakes. My name is Doc Billingsley, and I'm currently an assistant professor of anthropology at Elmira College. A quick overview of what I'll cover in this presentation. The first step is to discuss what we mean by interview, because interviews come in a lot of different shapes. It really helps to consider how formal an interview will be to decide how best to prepare for it. I'll offer a checklist of things to do before arriving for an interview, so you'll be prepared to focus and gather lots of great information. I'll talk a bit about what you can expect during the process of conducting an interview. That includes some strategies for designing questions that will help to approach the topics you're interested in, and some simple techniques to encourage your interviewee to feel comfortable and continue talking. I'll also briefly mention some of the simplest forms of analysis you can start to undertake after completing interviews. Things like transcribing the interview and looking for keywords and patterns. It's good to begin this as early as possible and try to continue it throughout your fieldwork to keep tabs on what kinds of information you're gathering and adjust your questions to follow the new ideas that emerge. Finally, it's important to consider our ethical obligation to our research participants. How do we safeguard their information and ensure that we uphold our agreement to protect their identity and preserve their data according to the protocols we established at the beginning of the research relationship? I'll point out some of the variables that might be involved in this final step and suggest some simple solutions. Before we can go very far into discussing interview techniques, we have to define what we mean by interview. Anthropologists spend a lot of time living in their fieldwork communities, and participants in a community documentation project are themselves often enmeshed within the communities they want to study. A lot of the information we gather and learn from each other actually comes about through what we might call informal interviews. These are just daily conversations between friends, neighbors, coworkers, and anyone else in a community. They aren't typically recorded or even acknowledged as a form of interview, but whenever you learn something new from someone, and you might even follow up by asking for more details, this is an important source of cultural knowledge. Learning from informal interviews requires a good memory and attention to details, and since these aren't usually recorded, it's important to take good field notes and make a record of what you remember as soon as possible. At the very least, most anthropologists type up the day's events each night, including bits of dialogue that they remember. While informal interviews are often our first and most frequent form of information in a community, they aren't really what most of us would consider an interview. An unstructured interview, on the other hand, is a conversation that is marked by all participants as being an interview, a different kind of conversation that has a designated purpose. Usually we let our research participant know ahead of time what we want to interview them about, so they have some time to collect their thoughts on the subject. Unstructured interviews don't really follow a specific set of questions. Each person just converses on topics around the chosen interview purpose. These types of interviews may be recorded. The next level of formality is a semi-structured interview. At this stage, it's customary to prepare a list of questions, what we call an interview schedule. But the goal is to let the interviewee steer the conversation wherever it may lead. You might begin with a few broad questions, but follow the interviewee's lead in veering out of order and off on interesting tangents to learn about details that you didn't know to ask beforehand. With the exception of everyday conversation that we might call informal interviews, most ethnographic interviewing falls into this semi-structured category. And an important little note, if you're interviewing someone and you expect you'll only get one shot at it, for example, someone whose time is really valuable or they're just not very accessible, it's probably best to prepare a list of questions beforehand to show that you've spent some time preparing for the interview and want to make efficient use of the time they've granted you. Finally, the most formal level of interview is a structured interview. In this type, the interviewer is basically following an interview script. reading a set of questions in the exact same order for every research participant, and trying to keep the stimuli as identical as possible to avoid influencing their responses. A census survey or questionnaire are examples of structured interviews. They can often theoretically be filled out by the research participant without an interviewer being present, but in some cases it's helpful to have a live spoken interaction to gather the information. And in cases where many of the people in the community are illiterate, structured interviews are the only reliable means of gathering survey data. In this presentation, I'm focusing almost exclusively on the semi-structured interviews. However, some of the strategies I mentioned would also apply to unstructured and structured interviews if you plan to use those in your research design. Preparing for interviews can help prevent frustration and ensure that you gather rewarding information. First, consider what kind of information you want to gather and who you should interview to gather it. When you're first getting started, it's often a matter of working with whoever is willing to talk to you, hopefully someone patient, and asking broad questions to find out the basic information about your topic. As you learn more about it, you'll figure out what kinds of details to focus on and what questions will help you to draw out those details from your interviewee's responses. Some basic tools are always useful. Take a notebook and pen to keep notes, even if you're recording the interview. On the one hand, it can indicate to your interviewee that you find their responses meaningful and worth writing down. On the other hand, you can refer back to your notes later on while you're listening to the interview and transcribing it. Your notes will show you what you thought was important during the original live interview, which might turn out to be different from what you find important while listening to it later. You can also record details about things going on during the interview that won't be noticeable in the recording. If a coworker or boss enters the room during the interview, make a note of it. It might cause your interviewee to change the subject or avoid sharing information, and your note can help you make sense of that change later on. If you plan to record the interview, make sure you know how to operate your device and make sure the batteries are fully charged. You might be surprised how quickly a cell phone will die while the microphone is running. If you can bring a backup battery or plug into the wall, go for it. There are a few things as disappointing as having to cut an interview short because your device is full or out of juice, or realizing afterwards that you missed half the recording because your device stopped working. In some cases, a small gift might be appropriate to acknowledge your interviewee's generosity with their time and knowledge. For example, inviting them to coffee and picking up the tab is usually a fair exchange. However, you should also consider the timing and location of the interview. Preferably, you want a quiet environment where you won't be interrupted. You also want your research participant to feel comfortable and secure, so a familiar environment might be best. Depending on the topic of your interview, privacy may be important to consider. Most folks won't mind talking about holidays and cuisine in a public place, but if you're asking questions about more personal or intimate details, privacy may be necessary. In my research, I often figure out which coffee shops are the quietest or have little nooks and crannies where an interviewee and I could settle in with our coffees and pastries and be fairly separated from the rest of the customers. Before interviewing, you'll need permission from people to interview them. And before recording any information, including field notes, you'll want to obtain informed consent, either written down on a release form or recorded on audio when you begin the interview. Explain to your interviewee what you're studying, why you're interviewing them, and what will happen to the recordings, notes, transcriptions, and any other data that you're collecting. In some cases, it might be appropriate to provide copies of the data directly to the interviewee when you're done. And this can also be a great way to gather more information in a follow-up interview and to get your interviewee to proofread, correct, and maybe annotate your transcriptions so you get even more data. Different research projects have different approaches to handling data and the identities of participants. For this community documentation project, the Arts Council created a release form for gathering interviews and videos to be used in our documentary projects, as well as to be archived at the Chemung County Historical Society. Given the purpose of our projects, preserving the identity of the participants is a goal, and we ask for the right to use people's names and likenesses in the materials. In other forms of ethnographic research, it may be more appropriate to grant anonymity to participants and take steps to prevent their identities from being discovered. You should craft your consent document according to the needs of your research project, and always grant people the ability to change their minds and withdraw permission later on. In this next section, I'm going to run through 9 different kinds of questions that you might develop to conduct your interviews. Some of these will probably seem quite obvious to you, and some may seem novel and creative. They're all worth exploring. You can go back and forth between some of the broader questions and the more specific, particular sorts of questions. So grand tour questions are often the best starting points. These are where you ask for everything the informant knows about the topic under consideration, and this allows the informant to tell you what is worth mentioning. It's often a good way to begin interviewing a new participant or a new topic with a familiar participant. Some examples include, could you describe a typical shift at your job? What is it like to live on campus at Elmira College? Could you list the major holidays in your community from January through December? Specific tour questions ask for description of a specific space or process or routine. It's still very general, but you get to set the scope of the discussion. Some informants are better at recalling specific events rather than responding to general queries. So, for example, what happened on your last shift at your job? What has happened in the past week on campus at Elmira College? What was the last major holiday in your community? Often what happens is you'll open with one of the grand tour questions, and if your research participant stares blankly at you, you might switch it up to one of these more specific contextual questions just to help jog their memory. And once they start talking about what happened at their last shift or in the past week or the last major holiday, they might go back and fill in some of the gaps and offer you more general information in response to your first question. Mini tour questions ask for even more details about something, like a keyword or folk term that emerged through grand tours or your own observations recorded in your notes. They're identical to grand tours, but they're focused on smaller units of experience. So you could ask, how do you clock in for a shift at your job? What are the rules for visiting other students' dorms on campus? Or what are the rules for gift giving during the Christmas holiday? Example questions ask for specific examples of something that was mentioned elsewhere in the interview. They deal with even smaller units of experience than mini tours, and they're often helpful for ensuring that you understand the details of an experience that was described in the context of a larger question and response. So things like, what kinds of things do you sell at your job? Or can you give me an example of a Christmas present that you received? Experience questions ask for details about an experience mentioned in response to one of the other types of questions, and this may provide information that would not otherwise come up naturally. These can often be so open-ended that informants have a hard time thinking of responses, so try to give specific context. Some examples: you mentioned that you clocked in late for a shift at your job. What were the consequences of that? You mentioned hanging out in a friend's dorm room. What did you do during that experience? Can you tell me about some of the foods you have eaten on Thanksgiving? Native language questions are devised to help you check to make sure that you properly understand the terms that your informant is using. Informants often learn to translate their experience into terms that you can understand as an outsider. But if you want to learn how they actually talk to each other about their experiences, you may need to explicitly request that they teach you the language they use. Some examples: what do you and other employees call the place where you work? Do you have a nickname for it? How do students refer to landmarks on campus? What terms do you use to define different types of gifts? Hypothetical questions ask your informant to respond to a hypothetical situation. And like experience questions, these can provide information that would not otherwise come up naturally. It's also another potential way of learning how informants actually speak to each other, native language questions. Examples: how would you and a coworker describe an unruly customer at your job? If you wanted to invite friends to meet you for dinner at the dining hall, what would you text them? On Valentine's Day, what kinds of expressions would you use to greet friends? Typical sentence questions ask for additional examples of how a phrase or folk term or keyword is used within a community. This can be helpful to ensure that you understand the full meaning of a folk term. Examples: you said that one customer was a total Karen. Who else would you describe that way? You mentioned the term re-gift. What are some examples of how that term is used? And contrast questions ask your informant to explain the differences between two things, including which they might pick and why. This is useful to gain an understanding of the characteristics of things, ideas, words, concepts, people within a community. Learning to distinguish between two fairly similar things requires a deeper understanding of how those things are organized and interpreted. So for example, how is an SUV different from a hatchback? Or what's the difference between a pumpkin pie and a sweet potato pie? Preparing questions is only a minor part of the labor required to make an interview work. You can also learn to probe and intervene to confirm that you're paying attention, that your informant is on the right track, and that you want them to tell you more details. The best probe to start with is the silent probe. Just look up at your informant to indicate that you're still listening, and know that sometimes people just need more time to gather their thoughts. You could also try the echo probe, which is where you repeat what they've just said or try to summarize a long statement to make sure that you understood it correctly. The nice thing about an echo probe is it doesn't redirect the interview, but it might elicit more details. It helps your informant to go back and think about what they've just been talking about and maybe fill in some more details that come to mind. The aha probe is where you offer some affirmative phrases like, yeah, okay, right. They help build rapport, they encourage a continued discussion, but beware that they could also be interpreted as approval for the ideas expressed. So if your informant was just talking about some horrible racist incident they oversaw and you're going, yeah, okay, sure, they might take that the wrong way. So be careful with your probe. The tell me more probe is where you explicitly ask, can you tell me more about that? And the useful thing about this is it allows you to redirect the discussion towards specific details that were mentioned, or in some cases to sort of bring the entire discussion back on track. And the long question probe includes a lot of context and description in order to direct the conversation towards specific details, either something that may have been mentioned but only briefly and you want to go back to it, or if the conversation has gone completely off the rails and you want to come back to one of your questions that you've written down. This might be a way to do it. So for example, think of the difference between asking, tell me what you did last month, and tell me what you did in the week before classes started and during the first week of classes. Trying to get someone to focus on a specific, time period where they are more likely to remember important events that happened. You can begin to analyze, look over your data, look over your interview transcripts, and start looking for patterns almost immediately after you've started gathering things. At first, you might reach a point where you feel like you're hitting the wall. After a few interviews, a few hours spent collecting information, making observations, you might begin to feel like you've gathered all the obvious stuff. Your interviewees may be getting bored with your questions, or at least it seems like they are, or it seems like they've told you everything that either of you can think to ask about. You might start wondering, where is this project going? What is there to study? So this is where it's important to step back and take inventory. At this point, you've probably got a pretty good idea of what a typical day is like for your informants or in your field site, or what a sort of general definition of your topic might be. You have probably identified several categories of people who participate in a culture or in a site, or categories of objects that are involved in the practice of a culture. And you may have concrete ideas about the activities that are involved in a site or culture. So evaluate your inventory. Information about routines is very valuable. Look for ideas in your field notes. Remember, if you're taking notes all along and you've been writing down what could be really key ideas that if you don't have them sort of crystallized there for you to look over in written form, they might be as fleeting as any other idea. They'll just disappear over time. It often takes a lot of time and trust before you can learn what a typical day looks like. So now that you have some ideas about what's ordinary, you can begin to identify patterns, analyze and seek the deeper significance of ideas, and recognize tensions, changes, and irregular events, and question what these may mean. Try to always consciously maintain naivete. It's really difficult to see things with fresh eyes when you're surrounded by your own native culture. Even when you're doing ethnography in a foreign country, you eventually grow accustomed to the differences and no longer see them. Try to keep challenging your own subject position and ask, if I had to be my informant in one of her social situations, would I know exactly how to act? Keep looking for the details. People will often answer your questions in a general way, especially if they think the details would bore you. Try to interview for backstage culture, what goes on behind the scenes. Ask your informants to walk you through the ideas and practices that they use before serving the public, or the things that take place outside of public view. For example, you could ask a server at a restaurant, what do you do to prepare a table before customers arrive? What are some strategies you use to get them to leave a better tip? You could ask a teacher, what do you do to prepare a classroom before the start of the day? How do you deal with unruly students? Finally, when the interviews are all wrapped up, it's important to maintain awareness and make concerted efforts to maintain your ethical practices after the interviews have been completed. At this point, the sought-after data has presumably all been gathered, your goodwill and rapport building paid off, and it can be easy at this point to become lax about maintaining efforts to build a relationship or reciprocate with your informants. Private interview data, especially identifying information, must be protected as established in the research design. And we should also try to account for unforeseen and unforeseeable changes in the future. Things like political changes at home or in our field site, especially if we work in a place where there has been a history of conflict. Technological changes that might jeopardize informants' anonymity. Basically, all of the encryption methods we have available today will probably be insecure within the next decade. So if the data should be kept anonymous, one old school but simple way to maintain that is to separate the identifying information from the transcripts and recordings. Basically use a keyword or number system for each recording, and then keep a log somewhere, an index where you can identify what actual person, what name goes to each of those keywords. If the data is to be preserved in an archive, be sure to save the least compressed format available to preserve fidelity for future researchers. And it's always a good idea to back up your data in secure formats, like burning it onto disks and then sending those disks to separate locations, or putting them onto cloud services that respect privacy. So that would not include Google Drive or Dropbox, which get surprising numbers of requests from governments all over the world every day to turn over access to customers' files. But there are other alternatives like sync.com that are unable to access your data. They actually don't have the ability to decrypt it on their end. So the best way to become more comfortable at interviewing is to practice. And you can do this with pretty much anyone. You can interview a friend about one of their interests, focus on their listening for details, try to craft a question that elicits more information about one of those details, and you can challenge yourself to see how much you can learn about a totally new subject simply from talking to someone that's knowledgeable about it. We have several more workshops coming up for this community documentation project, and we also have our Facebook group available for discussing problems and ideas that come up. So please let me know if you want more information about any of this or anything else related to research methods.